Well, everybody's very welcome to Social Justice Ireland's post-budget analysis. My name is John McGeady, I'm CEO, and with me today are Michelle Murphy, our Research and Policy Analyst, Suzanne Rogers, also Research and Policy Analyst, and Mansi Rawat, our Social and Economic Analyst. So we'll begin by discussing or going through the context for Budget 2025, and then we'll move on to look at some of the immediate impacts, particularly those on people on lower incomes and on issues of inequality. And then we'll move on to look at investment, taxation, and a broader review of the overall impacts, and finally looking at the overall impact of this budget in terms of whether it was progressive or regressive. So we might just begin with the socioeconomic context. So for those of you in the room, you will have a copy of our post-budget analysis report. And if you pop towards the end to pages 22 and 23, you can see there's a whole range of details and data that gives a picture of what's going on in Irish society this year and into next year. So in that we can see that the population of Ireland today is 5.38 million. And within that we see that there are a huge number of people living in poverty, with 559,850 people living below the poverty line. And of that number we can say that 176,912 are children. While there are almost 1 million people experiencing deprivation at 913,717 people. The poverty line is based on the median, 60% of the median income, and for one adult, the poverty line this year is, or in 2023 rather, is €323.99. Housing remains a major issue in Irish society. We can see that in terms of the current social housing waiting lists, there are 58,824 households on the waiting list. In terms of homeless adults, as of August 2024, we know that there are 10,067 homeless adults and 4,419 homeless children. The employment numbers remain very strong, with 2.75 million people in employment. However, unemployment remains an issue for those in unemployment, obviously, with 4.6% in unemployment. The national minimum wage has been raised to €13.50, but this is still below the living wage of €14.75, and average weekly earnings is €963. In terms of the macroeconomic picture, you can see that GNI, or modified GNI for 2025, is €331 billion. In terms of government expenditure, the ceiling for government expenditure in 2025 is 105. It's €105 billion. Changes in modified domestic demand has increased since last year by 2.9%, and the gross debt ratio as a percentage of GNI star in 2025 is 63.8 billion, which again gives a picture of where we are economically as well as socially. If you turn now to pages 12 and 13, we can look at a picture of where government has actually spent its money and where it has raised its money. So if we look first to page 12, you can get a picture of where the government is raising its revenues. And in total, we can see that PRSI accounted for €25.5 billion, income tax accounted for €36.3 billion, VAT accounts for €22.7 billion, and corporation tax accounts for €29.6 billion. We can see that income tax has increased by €2 billion, VAT has increased by almost €1 billion, Corporation tax receipts have increased by 5.1 billion, and PRSI receipts have increased by 2.1 billion. And then if we turn to page 13, you'll see the main sources of government expenditure in budget 2025, with 26.9 million on social protection, 25.8 billion on health, 16.4 billion on education, 7.9 billion on housing, local government and heritage, and then a whole range of other costs there. For example, servicing the national debt, 3.5 billion euro, etc. Social protection in this budget has increased by 2.3 billion. Health has increased by 4.3 billion. Education by almost 2 billion. And servicing the national debt has actually fallen by 0.7 billion this year. So it really is a huge budget package, as has been widely reported and as we've seen yesterday. If you turn to page 19, you'll get a sense of the public finances. And you can see on page 19, we give the public finances from last year, budget 2024, this year's budget now, budget 2025, that's been announced yesterday, and projections for 2026 as well. You can see that in terms of expenditure, the net current expenditure is 79.9 billion euro. You can see that tax receipts, the net current revenue for 2025 will be 108 billion euro, with a current budget balance of 28.6 billion euro. In terms of the capital budget for 2025, we can see that the gross voted capital expenditure is 14.9 billion euro. The net capital expenditure will be 22.5 billion euro. And overall, we can see that we have a general government balance of 9.7 billion euro for 2025, or 2.9% of GNI star. So that gives a picture of what's going on in our society, our economy. It gives a picture of the large numbers in budget 2025. But I suppose what we're here as Social Justice Ireland to talk about is really the meaning of the budget for our society. And if you turn to page 3, you can see really what we think about it almost right away, which is that while it is a budget of giveaways, ultimately it's one that hides a regressive shift. So budget 2025 joins a historic list of budgets in the coming immediately prior to an election, whenever we see huge giveaways. There's nothing unexpected by that politically. But of course, what it means is that rather than targeting spending on policies that would be that really target issues that are seriously damaging to society, what we see is a budget that tries to provide something for everybody. And particularly in budget 2025, we've seen that that's been done by providing many, many lump sum payments. In many ways, it's a missed opportunity to make real progress, given the huge resources we have available to ourselves. So, as we said, it follows a similar path adopted in the previous two budgets, with temporary measures, many of them coming now before 2025, before the end of 2024, as well as fewer temporary measures in 2025, but permanent tax changes. And what we have found in our analysis is that the one-off measures have certainly supported those on lower incomes. However, given that those temporary measures are just that, they're temporary, they will disappear, what you end up with is, in the long run, those on the lowest incomes not receiving the support needed, while those on higher incomes receive significant benefit through tax cuts and changes to tax policy overall. So what I'll do now is hand you over to to Michelle, exactly, yes, who will talk about some of the impacts. So Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, John. So first of all, I suppose we'll look at as John referenced, the legacy. So on page 4, there you can see overall the legacy of this budget, and actually all 5 budgets, is a widening of income gaps, primarily because of the upwards redistribution of resources, and that more of the permanent spending is going to those homes and households with higher incomes, and more of the temporary spending is directed at lower income households. And I suppose particularly if you look at this year's budget, a large proportion of those one-off payments, double payments, cost of living supports directed at welfare households are going to be paid before Christmas. So that pot of money cannot be included in your household budget for 2025, something which I think has really been missed, and it's going to be really challenging for those people, because you don't get energy bills just in October, November, December. You get them 12 months of the year. You pay your food bills every week. You pay your rent or your mortgage every month. So those households in real terms are actually facing a cut in income, which is what leads to the legacy of not just 1 but 5 regressive budgets when you strip out the one-off measures. Then I suppose moving on from that, looking at the gap between higher income households and lower income households, on page 8 there we look at the rich poor gap and the middle poor gap. So the rich poor gap is the difference in income between someone earning 100,000 euros, so they're in, I suppose, the top 6.5% of earners, so they'd be considered very high income earners, and someone on a job seeker's payment. So as a result of this year's budget, that gap has increased by over 23 euros a week. So it's going to be, on an annual basis, it increased by almost 1,000 euros. If you look over the 5 years of this government and their 5 budgets, that rich-poor gap has increased by nearly 19 euros a week, or just over 960 euros a year. So I think that's pretty telling. On the other side, you see the middle poor gap. So that's someone on earning about 40,000 euro and someone on a job seeker's payment. You see that the middle poor gap has actually reduced. It increased as a result of this budget, but over the 5 budgets it's reduced. But what that would indicate really is incomes being squeezed at the bottom. So from the middle down, incomes are being squeezed. Things aren't getting better for those households. And that's primarily as a result of the really limited impact of tax changes to people earning 40,000 euros or less, because they don't benefit from changes in the bands. They did get some benefit from the USC this year and increases in credits. But for those, down between 20 and 30, you really need refundable tax credits for that group. And I suppose, the reality is there in black and white. If the gap has grown, it means the money is not going to where it should be going. It's not going to the right households, particularly when you consider the resources that we have available. And we all know, and all the research shows, that higher costs impact more on lower income households. Then I suppose looking at child poverty, which we had the Taoiseach making child poverty a priority for this budget. We had the previous Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, made it a priority. He set up a unit. We had the Minister for Public Expenditure state in the Dáil in his speech that eradicating child poverty was a priority for this government. But I suppose when you look at where they put their money, that isn't going to be the outcome beyond the really welcome increases in what's now going to be the child support payment, was the qualified child allowance, and that is a payment directed at those households. Those increases are welcome. You didn't see sufficient incomes in adult social welfare rates. You didn't see an overall increase in child benefit. And for what they're spending on 2 double payments, you could have increased the child benefit by about 25 euros a month. So surely it's better to increase the monthly payment going into a household than just giving 2 large payments before Christmas, because those children are still going to cost you money in 2025. So that kind of gives you a flavour of, some tinkering around the edges. The same, there was welcome things in education in terms of free school books, the extension of the school meal programmes to all primary schools, a summer hunger pilot, extension of reduced student contributions, etc. But overall, the measures that really needed to be taken in terms of putting money into services for those families, in addressing issues such as low pay or adult welfare rates, it really didn't deliver. So it's not going to, bring about those poverty reductions that you will need. So I suppose our overall analysis, both in terms of legacy over 5 years, over 1 year, and in terms of child poverty, is that the measures that have been introduced, they're not going to, I suppose, deliver on government's stated ambition. And really, you could have made some far better choices with that money. So I will pass over to Suzanne now, who's going to go through, start with social protection and go through some other areas.
Thank you very much. I definitely need to keep an eye on time because social protection, and I can see some fellow comrades in the room, we have all of big thoughts about this. I mean, the headline from the department was that the largest social welfare package in the history of the state, providing 2.6 billion to assist households. If you want to follow along, it'll be page 16. I suppose primarily we'll have the context, what we got in the budget. And again, it's only picking out some highlights, like anybody who's familiar with the expenditure document knows it's huge. So these are just your headline stuff. But just, I think when we're having these conversations, I actually lose track of what billions and millions mean. 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 years. So the order of magnitude is quite something else. So when we talk about, I often kind of think, I nearly use them interchangeably. I never thought I'd be that jaded to sort of use these two terms interchangeably. But this is an enormous amount of money that's going into social protection. And I don't know what we're getting for it. And again, I would have concerns that if it's the largest package in the history of the state at a time of full employment, I don't know what that says. Does it say that this is going into pensions, which is an acknowledgement that this is going to be a continuing high cost? Is it going into low-income households where we're subsidising low-income households? So there's a lot going on, I think, in this package. Again, we have to welcome the primary social welfare rate increase of €12, but it goes nowhere near to even touching the sides of what most of us were looking for in order to maintain the purchasing power of low-income households. Age Action did an analysis of inflation which showed that €100 in 2024 has the same spending power that €84 had in 2020. So if you're on a fixed income, your money isn't going as far. So I think that's really key in this. Again, when they look at sort of what was going into households with children, we saw the switch from the QCI into what's now called the child support payment, 4 and 8, which again is less than we would have liked, but it was reassuring to see that they kept the gap and they kept that they didn't just give the same amount to both. So that was good. A lot of one-off payments again. I don't think we can call them one-offs if it's the third year in the row. Lump sum measures. And I can see like the department view these as, allowing low-income households, giving them a lump sum, which might allow you to save or pay off a big bill. But when they're gone, they're gone. And I think that's the thing. So at the end of the year, and again, they'll tell us that when you add it up, an extra £5 a week is the same as getting these lump sums. But that lump sum washes through, and then you're still, you're not better off. As I keep saying, a wage rise is worth more to me than a bonus because I can build on it incrementally. So I think we didn't see that. And again, even like the energy credits again, which we've talked a lot about. Even despite all of the energy credits that have gone in the past, I think like 1.6 billion, I think, has already gone in on energy credits. As of August this year, the country is still €146 million in arrears on our domestic gas and electricity. So we need to be coming at this again from a different angle. Throwing money at this isn't going to solve a lot of these problems. Again, there's a lot more detail in the document itself. I'm going to move on then to work, unemployment and jobs. Again, at a time where we are at quote unquote full employment. We need to be, I suppose, careful about how we frame that language. Statistically, I suppose there is quite, it's a very, very low percentage of people who are experiencing long-term unemployment. So looking at, what is going to encourage households back into the workforce if they can. So again, if we look at what we got in the budget, we did see an increase in the national minimum wage by 80 cent to $13.50. It's nowhere near the living wage, which I appreciate did come down by 5 cents when it was announced there 2-3 weeks ago. I think, mostly due to the renters' credit that had a little impact in it. You're looking at, I suppose, your increase of the tax bands, your standard rate cut-offs have increased by 2,000 to 44,000. The USC rate has been reduced. But again, a lot of this is going into the higher earner households. And again, I think we didn't see the refundable tax credit. So anybody who's on a low income isn't really going to benefit from a lot of these like again, welcome increase to the carers tax credits, the income thresholds for working family payments. All of those things are welcome. But again, it's a lot of money that's just tinkering around the edges of this. Then to move on to housing, I'm going to crack out my favourite Einstein quote when it comes to housing, which is, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So again, we need to be really, really clever, I think, about the amount of money that we're spending on housing, where it's going, what we're getting for our bang for our buck. Again, there's a lot of detail in the document itself, but I suppose a lot of it would be that going back to the same point over and over again, which we make, which the Central Bank makes, which the Housing Commission makes, the SRI makes, our targets are too low anyway, and then we still don't make them. And this has to be a conversation about social and affordable housing. Building lots and lots and lots of homes that nobody can afford is pointless. Everybody knows rent is going up, everybody knows mortgages are going up, and I don't think any of us are seeing the same increases in our wages. So home ownership is becoming less and less likely. We have a conversation coming down the path again about older people in private rented accommodation, record numbers on homelessness. So again, we didn't see allocation to something we've been asking for a very long time, which is to extend housing first to children and families. The statistics show that children and families are spending way, way, way too long in emergency accommodation. So that is going to, again, store up issues for the future for these young people who are very much being left behind. We have an issue with vacant properties and derelict and underutilised land. Again, massive untapped resources there. And I know there's a piece of work being done with the RTB and the CSO to actually figure out what are we talking about in this space? Who's a registered landlord, who isn't, who has an empty home, who doesn't. So there's a lot of work that can be done in that space. I'm going to move on then to healthcare very quickly. This is, again, an ongoing conversation, enormous amounts of money going into our healthcare system. We still don't really see the infrastructure investment required for the rollout of Sláintecare, which would have a massive impact on all areas of health service. Again, we're the only country without universal primary care coverage. Again, that's the context. In August, we had over 600,000 people on hospital waiting lists. Over 50,000 of those were on the waiting list for more than 18 months, and 7,200 of those are children. So that's what we're facing into. And again, in a country awash with money. So we need to be clever about how we're spending our money. We got allocations for the introduction of new beds and replacement beds in acute and community hospitals. We got funding for quicker access to urgent and emergency care. We had 6 injury units, expansion of emergency departments in 5 hospitals. We have, again, a welcome additional 8 million being provided to the National Ambulance Service. Sorry, this is page 17. Again, all of these things are welcome. We have an expansion in home support services for older people, but we're not seeing that statutory right to home care being put through. And again, I suppose the exclusion of healthcare infrastructure from the priority areas to benefit from all of this massive expenditure. Again, it's another missed opportunity, and Sláintecare really, really needs to be accelerated. I will go on then to education. And again, I suppose for context, we are, one of the best educated countries in the world. So I think that is to be acknowledged, but we're always looking then at that disaggregated data. So if you're at 97% of something, who are the 3%? Who are we not servicing in this space? We had extra money for additional SNAs, extra special ed teachers, page 15. We had a one-off reduction in student fees for apprenticeships. We had extra student contributions, one-off measures then in the postgrad fees. So again, lots of things being done. The free hot school meals programme to all primary schools, again, welcomed. The junior and leaving cert fees, again, waived for another year. I think I might just get in under the wire there, hopefully. Reduce school transport fees, things that really, really make a difference. And again, the SVP have always said as well that they saw their calls for assistance drop once the free school meals and the free school books came into play. So this is really, really making a difference. Again, we saw an acknowledgement of the need to bridge the core funding gap in higher education with an allocation of 150 million from the NTF to address this, although it's still short of what's required. We didn't see a commitment again to reducing class sizes and pupil-teacher ratio, which again we know really makes a difference, and especially for the younger children. And I'm going to finish with this. I'm going off on a tangent. I was at watched Paul McCartney documentary at the weekend, and he was talking about when he was 14 and he wanted, a career in music, and it was only cabaret. So he thought, Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett. And I'm kind of going, imagine a world in which a young Paul McCartney wasn't able to harness the opportunities afforded to him by the advent of rock and roll. What a different world we'd live in. So it's that thing of prepping our young people to be able to take advantage of whatever opportunities are coming along, because we have no idea what they are. We genuinely, I don't know what's coming down the line, but they need to be equipped to harness that. So things like pupil-teacher ratio, that individual attention, the SNAs, all of that is going to go a long way. And I think that's me. I'm going to hand back to, actually, Mansi now, I think, has taken over from me. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now be talking about taxation measures and public finances. And to begin with, as we all know, Ireland's economy is in a very strong position, and the headline rate has moderated. However, that does not mean the cost of living pressures are still not there. The rapid increase in prices in the past few years has posed a particular challenge for low-income households, as you can see in page 10 chart. Lower income households are the ones that are experiencing significant price increases. For like all the households, it's 7.4%, while for the bottom quintile, it's 8.1%. So we can see the stark difference in the experiences of significant price pressures. And these are also the households that spend a lot on goods and services that are exposed to price increases, such as food, housing, and energy. And policy really needs to effectively target these low-income households, which, as has been also stated by all my co-workers, that has not been the case in this budget. With this, we can see that last year, 2 new funds were introduced, that were the Climate Fund and the Future Island Fund. However, these windfall gains have been reserved, and it was indicated that there would be over 16 billion in these funds over the next year. And it is crucial to carefully manage and strategically invest these resources in one-off projects. But it's kind of concerning that no detailed action plan has been provided on how these funds will be utilized, even after a year of introduction. There was a PRSI increase, which is still inadequate because, considering that there's a looming shortfall in the social insurance fund with an aging population. Ireland really needs a sustainable approach to fund essential social services, and our PRSI rates are low in terms of in comparison to our international counterparts. So it's really important, and we encourage the government to really consider more substantial increase. We had proposed a 0.5% increase in the rate, which would have raised an additional 900 million euros, but we regret that only a very small amount was added over here. With this, I would like to mention that there is also another challenge, which is of the debt costs that remains high. Despite the current windfall corporate tax revenues, Ireland continues to have a large level of national debt. As you can see in chart 10.1, it's over 3 billion in the next few years. And another worrying aspect of the budget is the scale of tax expenditures. This year, a lot of tax measures were extended, such as the research and development costs of the companies, profit made by the startups, mortgage interest relief. In addition to that, there were a few that were introduced, like audiovisual sectors, as well as increase in the threshold for the intergenerational wealth transfers. So these are kind of worrying, because when we look at Ireland's overall tax take, it remains inadequate. Although the tax receipts, as you can see in page 7, are going to climb up to, are currently at 106 billion and are going to climb up to 126 billion in 2030. But these are gains because of the windfall earnings. And as we all know, this is highly unsustainable, as at any point corporation tax can reduce. So a lot of reliance on this is going to put pressures in the fiscal, in Ireland's public finances. So we believe that over the next few years, Ireland should focus on increasing sustainable tax, as without these windfall tax, the general government balance is projected to have like a deficit in 2024 of 4.6 billion, and this is going to also be in the next few years. Social Justice Ireland believes that Ireland's overall level of taxation should be 25,000 per capita in 2024, and this should be excluding the windfall tax. One of the permanent income gains that we saw in Budget 2025 were the changes to income taxation and headline welfares. As you can see in page 6, chart 6.1, shows the impact of income tax and headline welfare rates. We can see that the gains were skewed upwards. And if you want to particularly look at the chart, you see that in earners of 25,000, who had earnings of 25,000, especially couple earners, would be losing 50 cents a week. So this is kind of showing those people who are on part-time jobs or who are underemployed would be the one who would be losing from this budget more. Other than that, we can also see in table 6.1 the effective tax rates, and as you can see, with each passing year, it's decreasing, which is concerning again, because even though we have windfall gains, these are not sustainable. It is also remarkable that little attention has been given to consolidating the tax base for the future generation. And while we welcome the increases in the income tax credits, the increase, it should have been higher, as well as, we also welcome the increase in the vacant homes tax. However, it should be more substantial, as it's still not addressing a huge number of vacant properties that are in Ireland, and that can be also seen through the Revenue Commissioner's statistics that only 6,000 properties were registered, while there are more than 100,000 at least vacant and derelict properties in Ireland. So it's there's an implementation gap over here. We also welcome an increased stamp duty on bulk residential purchases, because that might improve the housing situation. However, we regret that there were a lot of regressive subsidies that were continued, such as the Help to Buy scheme, which does not address the housing supply, as well as is more benefits more the high income earners, as well as the rent tax credit, which again is only benefiting those who are paying those taxes, and that is again high income earners. The mortgage interest tax relief is again poorly targeted and is not reaching many of those who are in need of assistance. And we also feel that a lot of tax opportunities were missed, including making personal tax credits refundable, as well as increasing the minimum effective tax rate for high income earners was another missed opportunity, because that's where we could have generated more income. And I think, I would like to pass on to Michelle, who would share about the impacts of the budget.
Oh, thanks, Mansi. And we should have said this in the beginning. For anyone who's tuned in on Zoom, you can put your questions into the chat for the Q&A section. So I'm just going to look at the impact on some different groups. It's on page 11. So as Suzanne said, we do welcome the increase in the minimum wage of 80 cents per hour. So it's a stepping stone on the way to the living wage. We're not there yet, but it is progress. In terms of rural Ireland, then, there was a limited increase in funding, which is welcome, but I suppose overall, given particularly, some of the windfall resources that were available to government, you didn't really see a targeted sort of investment package, particularly for infrastructure in the regions. You know, prime example would be there's a commitment for a new train service to the northwest to hit Donegal. I didn't really see any announcement in the budget on how we might begin to progress that, even in terms of road maintenance or making sure the bus fleet is electric, for example, to meet our, you know, those are all, you only buy that bus once. So I suppose that is disappointing. We had proposed a more substantial package in terms of, I suppose, supporting regional development as we meet our digital and green transitions. I suppose that didn't really like jump out of the budget to us. And I suppose there was some welcome bits in there for small businesses, but overall I think we probably didn't see what some organisations would have liked in terms of rural investment. In terms of older people, again, as Suzanne has pointed out, an awful lot of what's targeted at them is one-off. We do welcome the welfare increases, but as noted by the CSO in their survey on income and living conditions this year, the poverty rate among older people would have doubled last year if there hadn't been those one-off cost of living payments. So I think that says a lot, because again, you know, there is a lump sum fuel allowance payment, but no increase in the rate, you know, and it's the rate that's going to make the most difference to people. So I suppose we would just point that out again. And there doesn't seem to be any plan in terms of, we're aging, our population is growing, so how are you going to pay for pensions, home help services, all those things in 2030, 40, 50, 60, that wasn't evident. In terms of disability and disability services, again, I think this is the third year in a row we had some sort of lump sum payment. I think this is the second one that acknowledges there's a cost of disability, but no progress on implementing the findings of the cost of disability report, which I think they have had now for 4 years, Flocta, is it? That's incredibly disappointing. When it comes to the overall allocation for disability services, it's really unclear how much is to deliver just the existing level of service and how much is new. That breakdown isn't there. And overall, I would argue that there still hasn't been enough of an investment to really deliver, I suppose, the returns for people. Even if you look at the commitment to eradicate child poverty and provide services for children, if you're just looking at children with a disability or additional needs who need a place in school, there was no additional announcement to say, well, we do have the money to build the classrooms for those children, to buy the school buses to take those children to school. That's an infrastructure one-off cost. Yes, you need to go to your current expenditure to fund the teachers, the SNAs, the bus drivers. But so where is the vision within that 25 billion for those children? It doesn't exist, it would appear to me anyway, unless it's going to be an announcement that's made today. In terms of just transition, again, there was another allocation to the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund out to 2030, which is welcome, but we would like to see a bit more detail on what that's actually going to be spent on. You know, they've had 12 months now to come up with a plan for this fund beyond the NDP. I suppose there's a bit of lack of clarity, and I suppose care must be taken. We are going to be making infrastructure investments, but that infrastructure has to be maintained. That's going to be a current cost. So how are we going to fund that going forward? In terms of sustainability, the increased resources for the Warm Home Scheme is really welcome. There is an allocation from the sale of AIB shares to upgrade the national grid. That is also really welcome. We've been calling for that for, you know, a considerable number of years. But again, a lack of progress on community energy advisors. If you're going to reach those hard to reach households in energy poverty, upgrade their homes, you know, reduce energy poverty, you know, you need to be looking at community energy advisors. You need to be looking at the auctions in terms of renewable energy. And like two simple things that could have been done are a building renovation passport scheme and a farm sustainability passport scheme. Two pilots wouldn't have cost a lot of money, would have made real progress, and both of those areas weren't introduced in the budget, so that is disappointing. Finally, then, I'm going to move to overseas development assistance on page 19. Again, we welcome the allocation. It's less than half of what's actually required to get us to our target of 0.7% of GNI Star over the next 5 years. The second thing I would point out is that there's a lack of transparency in terms of the numbers. So we have climate finance, we have ODA, and we have a loss and damage fund. they're not broken down in terms of within that 810 million. And we also have the spending to support Ukrainian refugees is included in the overall ODA budget, but that money is spent here. You know, so there's certainly a bit of, I suppose, cloak and dagger going on here, and would be really, really good to have some transparency and clarity on those numbers. Finally, in terms of the SDGs, I suppose it's disappointing not to see them embedded within budgetary policy, and a bit more progress in terms of accounting for ecosystem services and natural capital accounting in the budget, and actually charging companies for what nature provides to them, I think would be a better way of generating funds for biodiversity rather than, you know, looking at some other taxation elements. So now I will pass over to John.
Thanks very much, Michelle. So I'll just sort of summarise a little bit, but I mean, obviously you've heard quite a comprehensive review of a whole range of different issues dealt with in the budget. If you turn now to pages 1 and 2, you'll see our sort of our editorial, and again a summary of our overall take on this budget. And as you can see from the headline, essentially we say yes, it's a giveaway budget, but it ultimately leaves a legacy of a regressive legacy. And I think the thing that really maybe highlights that, and again, this is the issue with one-off payments, and the fact that government has relied on one-off payments so much, is that, as has been said already, whenever those one-off payments end, the people who needed them will not have that income next year or in following years. And whereas whenever there are changes made in tax policy, we can see that the gains from changes to taxation, they are permanent and they remain. And invariably, obviously, people who earn more gain more from tax cuts, and people who earn less or who maybe aren't in work for whatever reason don't gain those benefits. And in fact, what we can say is we've done a distribution analysis of this budget as we do every year, but we've also looked at the 5 budgets of this government, and we can see that a couple with only one earner on €100,000 a year is better off by €73.35 per week due to the last 5 budgets, whereas a couple with one earner on €30,000 a year is only better off by €3.34 per week after the 5 budgets of this government. Which really means that for somebody on €100,000, they're better off by €70 than somebody on €30,000 as a result of budget policy over the last 5 years. And that clearly is regressive. And certainly government has made many, many efforts in this budget and in the previous 2 budgets to try to address the cost of living pressures. And certainly those lump sum benefits that came this year and that came last year and the previous year are welcome when they come, and they're very, very needed. But the fact that they're so needed reveals that what we actually have here is an underlying issue of serious poverty and deprivation in our country. You know, where 10% of the population is below the poverty line, where almost 1 million people experienced deprivation in 2023. So if we don't translate the value of one-off lump sum payments into ongoing income supports for people, what you end up with is, come this time next year, those at the bottom will be worse off compared to those at the top than they were yesterday. And that ultimately makes this budget regressive, and ultimately it speaks to a legacy of regressive budgets, unfortunately, over the last 5 years, taken together in the round when we look at the cumulative impact. In terms of addressing cost of living and addressing that serious income adequacy issue, what we can say is that the €12 increase in core social welfare rates that came out yesterday was totally inadequate, and we would say actually less than half of what was required. Socialist Ireland's recommendation was that core social welfare rates needed to be increased by €25 this year. And the fact that it's only been increased by €12 is really, really a problem. Particularly when we consider that some of those welfare rates, and Michelle mentioned that with regards to child poverty, you know, the Taoiseach said that it was a priority of this budget. Last year it was a priority of the budget. The Child Poverty and Welfare Unit has been set up, and yet the child benefit payment has not been increased since 2016, even though we've gone through a tumultuous period of huge inflation that, yes, thankfully is coming down, but the costs that went up will not come down. So those costs remain, and yet those core payments, particularly the child benefit payment, did not increase. Yes, the qualified child increase went up under the new name of the Child Support Grant. But again, if we are serious about child poverty, and if we're serious about poverty across our society, and given the enormous resources at our disposal, the fact that we haven't addressed it is really quite damning. In terms of taxation, we've already heard, again, the increase in the increase in the threshold for the higher rate of tax from 42,000 to 44,000 only benefits those people earning above 42,000. And yes, we absolutely welcome the increase in the personal tax credits, which reach everybody. You know, it reaches all workers in our economy. But more could have been done there. You know, those tax increases could have been increased. Tax credits, personal tax credits could have been increased. But more importantly, we really regret the fact that those personal tax credits were not made refundable, which has been a long-standing policy of Social Justice Ireland. Because if you don't earn enough to gain the full value of your tax credit, you know, if you don't earn enough so they're not paying enough tax to be able to claim it back, you don't get the value of it, even though you're the person who is most in need of it, because you're the person with the lower income. Making that refundable would have had a serious impact on people who are in work and in poverty, which again we see from the SILC data is increasing and has been increasing. The numbers of people in work who are at risk of poverty below the poverty line. So we also know that we have a major housing crisis in this country. There's nothing new there, unfortunately. Again, we really are disappointed, and it was mentioned already by Suzanne, we really are disappointed that significant investment was not made in that. Yes, there was a significant package of 1.25 billion euro announced yesterday, but it was only to provide the 10,000 new builds that was already committed to. We wanted to see an increase in that commitment and a corresponding increase in funding. And until we build more homes and until we build more social homes, we are not going to address the housing crisis in this country. Ultimately, this budget seems to lack vision. Again, with huge resources available to it, the planning doesn't seem to be there. There was lots of references to, you know, huge sums of windfall will go towards water infrastructure and housing and the electricity grid, but no detail was provided. And again, as was said previously, the fact that the two funds that were announced last year still have no clear plan in place speaks to a lack of vision. With the amount of money and the amount of wealth in our country, there's no reason why we can't do something significant. But I suppose the issue is money isn't everything, but you can't do anything without it. But what you absolutely need is you have to have some sort of sense of national purpose. And this budget doesn't seem to have that. So now I think what we'll do is take any questions, and if you have, and for those who are online, thanks Michelle for mentioning it, if you're online, if you're tuning in on Zoom, you can put a question in through the Q&A and we'll try to address it. And if anybody in the room has any questions, there's a roving mic that will go around. So by any means, we'd be delighted to take any questions that you might have, or indeed any comments that you may have as well.
Oh, sorry,
Kitty. And sorry, I'll just hand over to Michelle to chair the Q&A.
Just want to get your thoughts on, there's no real mention in the budget, in the social protection package of lone parents, and obviously they predominate in the homelessness statistics and in child poverty, and the income thresholds for the one-parent family payment didn't increase Would you have concerns about that?
I might pass that over to Suzanne.
I was just checking the online ones. I mean, the Department of Social Protection do an online briefing the day of the budget, so all of the sector is there yesterday. So again, there was a lot of questions from each of the sectors kind of going, what about the communities that I represent? There was a lot of questions, all right, about what supports were there for lone families, and the rhetoric is this was a family friendly budget, but I don't know which families they were talking about. So I think again it goes back to that piece where all of these were the lump sum measures, which are always welcomed, but they need to be on top of the increase in core rates. And exactly what you've said, when you look at the poverty statistics, it's the same cohorts that come up time and time and time again. So we know where we need to put our money. So I appreciate the 2 double payments, the one-offs we had, but there was no increases to the core rates, which I think is that's really where it needs to go. So the extra 12 is that it's not even touching the sides. But I mean, that whole lone parent piece as well, I think housing is a massive issue. Childcare is a massive issue. So there's lots of sort of interconnected pieces.
Disregards, is that a concern?
I mean, it was...
Went up for carers and for working families, but not for lone parents.
For lone parents, I'd need to probably do another kind of deep dive into this. But I mean, there was questions again about even within sort of, all of the disregards and stuff like that. So there was definitely questions asked. And the answer you'll get is, we have limited resources. We're trying to give as much as we can to as many people as we can. But even that argument, I'm not sure how it stacks up. You can't really say you've got limited resources when we're constantly finding billions down the back of the couch. But it is, it didn't seem to be as targeted because, again, as we keep saying, child poverty is family poverty. It's not like, again, it's not that these kids just can't get their act together. Their families are fine, and then, you keep spending your pocket money too quickly. So it is about family poverty, and I don't necessarily know. We can call it child poverty and anti-child poverty measures, but unless we're addressing family poverty, which I don't think that this budget really did, it isn't going to go far enough, I don't think. But no, there was a lot of questions last night from our colleagues who were representing the lone parent organisations.
Thanks, Kitty. And I suppose just further point in terms of the disregards, it's the knock-on impact that can have on benefits you might be getting from other departments. And I would hope, and we would hope, that the department had examined that fully before they decided, not to change it.
And I think that's another reason why we're always calling for an increase in child benefit. So even though it is universal, it's not going to, because again, the first question that you get asked when you talk about increases in social welfare is work disincentive. So that immediately comes in. So a payment like child benefit, there's no disincentive to any threshold. So I think that really would be key to making sure that child benefit payment would be increased and that the core rate is bedded in month after. As you said, we can't get rid of our kids come the Christmas. Once we get our 2 double payments, they're still going to cost us money in 2025. So I think it's exactly that piece around the disregards and the thresholds again are really, really key. And they're not joined up in a lot of places as well, the thresholds, which is quite concerning.
Thanks, Kitty. Any other questions?
I would just say on the
Deputy Cameron Walsh.
taxation, I think you're right on the taxation. Obviously, it works in the way that the more you earn, the more you benefit from it. So our calculations on that is if you earn 150,000 euro a year, you would get almost €1,000 benefit from it. But if you earn 40,000, you get less than 400 euro from it. So surely the better thing could be done would be to abolish the USC for all earners under 30,000 euro, going up, obviously, as our policy is going up to 45,000 euro, so that the average worker the average earner doesn't pay USC. And that way it would be more progressive. But I really take your point in terms of the regressiveness of the budget and the budgets, all the budgets in a line. If you were to take out the once-off payments, we have had regressive budgets for the last 5 years. And I think it's somewhat covered up by the once-off payments.
Yes, it is. I suppose in terms now of the USC, I would say that we wouldn't be supportive of abolishing it or reducing it. Is probably the one thing we've managed to do well as a country is in design a tax that can't be avoided. That is the real value of the USC. You can't avoid it no matter how much you earn. And that's the one positive thing about it, because there's so many other allowances that assist high income earners and very high income earners in terms of avoiding paying income tax, whereas low income earners can't benefit from that. Now, obviously, because of the way the tax system is constructed and changing bands and standard rates, it means the only real way to reach that group is by making changes to the USC. A far better way would be to make tax credits refundable and then make any changes to the tax credit system. And overall, I mean, John pointed out that the bulk of the revenue that the Exchequer is taking in, when you strip out corporate tax, it's coming from income tax, PRSI and VAT. And really looking at income tax and PRSI going forward, as the labour force is going to shrink and we're going to have more people, you know, who are going to be outside the labour force needing support, we really need to be looking at where are you going to raise the taxes. You can't be consistently looking at the labour force. You have to look at broadening the base. And I suppose that's what was really missing from the tax package. We narrowed our tax base, but we didn't broaden it in any way, sense or form. And that's, you know, to go to your point, that's really disappointing, because you can't have progressive budgets if you don't look at where you're taking your money in, how you're taking it in, and then where you're spending it. I don't know, John, if you have
Well,
any...
I think it's really important about how we think about tax in this country. And we really need to understand that, yes, sometimes it's about trying to alter behaviour, but fundamentally it's a question of resourcing our society. And it's a question of resourcing our public services, and it's a question of asking how we can redistribute as necessary to support incomes. And we need to ensure that we have a tax base that's broad enough and that's secure enough for the future. Particularly, as Mansi mentioned, you know, we know that the huge windfall gains that come in are not sustainable. There's always a risk associated with them, and we have to assume that what's required is as a permanent method of generating revenue. So.
You have to make the money count as well. It's not just about taking it in, it's about how it's spent. And
absolutely.
For how it's spent.
100%.
Sorry, I'm to rush for leaving.
No worries. Thanks very much, Deputy.
Sorry, first I have David there, and then I think we might jump online, because I'm very conscious, but David first, and then Suzanne, I'll let you get a few online questions and I'll come back to the room.
Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks very much. It's again, a huge benefit to have this documentation and this summary available to everybody. You've done a wonderful job. There's two things that I'd like to maybe, again, highlight. Following on from what you've just said, the narrowing of the tax base, it's desperately disappointing that there's no, although maybe not surprising, that there's no attempt to introduce any form of wealth tax or asset tax as recommended by the Commission on Taxation and Welfare. And really, in terms of when such a tax should be introduced, surely the best time is when the resources are there, because in the case of an asset tax, it's highly uncertain as to what values, what resources would be brought in terms of tax receipts, simply because there's no accurate estimate of the assets that people actually hold. The data is not there. So it's very disappointing, but again, not surprising that it's not included in this budget or referenced. The other thing which I think needs some wider consideration and discussion is the fact that they are continuing to make certain benefits universal, such as the energy credit. And again, we have the examples provided by the COVID payments, the EWIS and the TWSS, the Employment Subsidy Scheme and the Temporary Subsidy Scheme, which were implemented by means of marrying up an attempt to provide income to people on the basis of how much they earned. Because there's a huge wealth of information with respect to people's earnings being provided by employers on a weekly, monthly basis. So such provisions of additional credits can in fact be nuanced, can be selectively provided to those who are earning below certain thresholds instead of being provided on a universal basis. And by targeting such credits, you're actually going to be able to provide much higher levels of credits to those who need them most. Instead, we have people who own 2 or more houses having 2 or more energy credits, which is absolutely crazy. So I think the targeting of such credits and allowances can and should be done, but there's a refusal to do so, which I think is very, very disappointing.
Thank you, David. We'd certainly agree with that. I mean, we managed to increase the threshold for one of the few wealth taxes we have, you know, on the basis of arguments that it doesn't generate much money, but that's not the point. It's one of the few wealth taxes we have, and what's to say it won't start generating money in the future? Really limited progress there. And if you look at the energy credit, I mean, I think Friends of the Earth pointed out it's more than the entire retrofitting budget, the cost of that. And you still had 500,000 people last year who couldn't heat their homes adequately after 1.6 billion euros in energy credit. So it's not being put into those households where it needs to go. Now, Suzanne, I did promise to let the people online in before we come back to the room.
That's grand. But I just want to pick up on the wealth taxes. Like the Central Bank have done a really, really insightful short piece on just looking at wealth in Ireland, just in general, which I think is really interesting because there's not much written about it anyway. And then the Parliamentary Budgetary Office did a recent piece again on wealth taxes. So it's a conversation that I can see starting to grow here and, you know, and in other jurisdictions, because I mean, it's what we can see is like where money is going. You know, if the pie is only so big, if the pie isn't getting any bigger, you know, it's definitely. And again, even conversations around we've gender income gaps, but now we've got gender wealth gaps and gender pension gaps. So I think it is something that's going to. I think it will grow legs. I think it'll definitely show up online. Our colleague Donal O'Shea has a lot of comments. I'm going to come back to him, but he just, I suppose, just to touch on, he does mention the work of the PPNs and civic forums. There. I didn't really touch on them in the presentation, but there's kind of a headline commitment to the public participation networks, but I couldn't find the money, so I need to go and have a proper look for that. Do you know what I mean? Like that multi-annual funding, because the work of the PPNs is only growing and growing and growing and growing. So it's just to acknowledge that. And then the other one then is what supports for youth work came from yesterday. So I've done a very quick Control F on the big expenditure piece. And there's 8.1 billion allocated to the Department of Equality, Children, DECIDY, Youth Integration, Disability. But when we actually look at youth work, there's a commitment to expand youth work services capacity, fund 10 new targeted youth services to support young people who are disadvantaged, vulnerable or marginalised under the department's UBU programme. I suppose I'd have concern there that I think youth work should be, you know, it is something like youth projects and youth work. It should be something that is available to every young person and not just looking at, you know, sort of a stigma attached to access to youth work. And then there's also a new pilot initiative to support selected youth services to provide meals to those accessing its services over school holiday periods, which again is is a concern. And I think a lot of youth work is based around food anyway. Come down for a pizza slice, but now they seem to be more and more of them are sending their young people home with food, so at least it is an acknowledgement. But that is something that we had in our pre-budget submission, was support for that youth work services and really putting money into a space for all young people to access that's safe and collegiate, that's away from home. You know what I mean? And you know, so I just think it's a good question. So thank you for that. And as I said, most of Donal's then are, you know, a lot of comments about policy coherence, and which again we are big fans of. So I think that's.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. I can see Flocta, Donal, Sean. So I'll start with Flocta, even if you weren't first, because you caught my eye first this time.
Hi, Flocta Phelan from the Disability Federation of Ireland. A couple of comments and a couple of questions. I hope I suppose it's really disappointing to see cost of disability being bracketed as a cost of living issue again. We know that the cost of disability is ongoing and lifelong, so the idea that a one-off €400 payment that is unpredictable and not guaranteed next year might help people pay the extra heating bills, for the extra assistive technology, etc., is just ridiculous. And I suppose it's disappointing in the context of the public debates we've had this year about supports for disabled people in the community, in the context of the referendum and the ill-fated Green Paper reform proposals as well. I wanted to pick up on Kitty's question about income disregards as well, because we also don't see income disregards increased for people with disabilities, which again is really concerning because there was a huge amount of feedback in the Green Paper process around what needed to change. And we know we have an untapped set of people who can work if we address the structural barriers that make it very difficult for our disabled community to take up employment because of the risks involved. Michelle, you said yourself that the health and support services budget is very unclear. We're facing down the barrel of industrial action and strikes amongst organisations that deliver disability supports in the community again this year because pay parity hasn't been addressed and everybody is struggling with the cost of living. Just wanted to note the housing adaptation grant as well. It's one small but specific thing in the context of housing, but I think it's important because a lot of people can't go home after they acquire a disability because they need to change their house. The housing adaptation grant limit hasn't increased since 2007, so it has been increased, the maximum amount, from 30,000 to 40,000, but it's nowhere near enough. We had suggested 60 because the level of inflation that is there since then is really significant. Okay, I do have two questions as well. One is, I suppose, a concern I have, and I'm sure many of us do, is, and we see it in the data already, that the one-off payments are actually skewing the information that we have around poverty, because it looks like poverty is improving, but if you strip out, as the Silk did for the 23 data, you see that actually you take out the one-off payments. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that, because I feel like we understand that long term actually this isn't addressing poverty, but the data isn't necessarily showing that because these one-off payments are confusing the information. And then I suppose, look, we're all in election mode as well. It's slightly surreal. So the second question is, what now? What do we need to see from the next government? How and in what way do we think we can have a strengthened approach to equality proofing of budgets in the future for the next government? Because we do hear from the department and from the government that the budgets are poverty proofed and equality proofed, and yet that isn't the lived experience of the various communities that many of us strive to advocate on behalf of in this room. So I'm curious what you think we need to see for the next government to do better.
Thanks very much, Flocta. And you know what? I might just take the other two questions as well, so then we can answer them all together. So,
yeah, no, thanks a million. So Donald Swan here from the National Women's Council. So first of all, thank you all, and thank you Social Justice Ireland for putting this together and doing this absolutely so quickly after the budget. It's an incredible piece of work to have literally the morning after the budget's been announced. Yeah, a few general points from me and a couple of kind of questions, and I suppose building on what Flocta has said, our kind of general response to it was really not dissimilar in terms of being very concerned about the as Suzanne, you say, can you really call them once-offs anymore if it's the third time, and in that sense the absolute kind of lack of I suppose structural change and interest in structural change around how these systems work. And I think it goes to show around those the thresholds. We're very very happy to see thresholds and disregards increase for, say, the carers allowance and the working family payment, but of course that leaves out so many other payments, and it's a kind of you never know in a given year which thresholds are going to go up, which aren't, and the need, I suppose, and to move towards a system, I suppose, that actually does it in a more evidence-based way, and those issues around benchmarking both of rates and of disregards and thresholds, and I think it's very stark when you kind of you add in again the temporary stuff of the lack of any security what coming up to a budget is just extraordinary, and seems to have even grown over the last couple of years. And I'd be very interested to know in terms of what you think around, because that goes to how people use money as well, and how people are able to use their income when they're either able to rely on it and to rely on particular increases at a particular point in time of the year, or they aren't. And we are in a scenario where more and more, with an increased emphasis on one-off expenditure, people aren't, and that particularly impacts people on low incomes in a particular way. And I'd agree with you in terms of definitely in terms of the child benefit and a missed opportunity in terms of going for double payments instead of increasing it. That's such an important support for women. Again on the tax changes, I think one of the things that I'm really glad to see, and I'm really always great to see from yourselves versus, to be honest, the department is the description of how much everyone's going to get from tax and welfare changes in actual terms rather than as a percentage of income, because it can really skew. And I know even on the call yesterday with the department, seeing as a percentage of income how certain quintiles are supported. But when you actually break that into actual real monetary terms, of course, the higher earners get significantly more actual money in their pockets when it comes to these tax changes, because that max out at 70 grand if you want to take the full cut from the USE. So I'll stop talking now, but I just interested to hear if there are any particular kind of thoughts on, I suppose, the gendered impact of that of course cuts across everything we've been talking about, and there are certainly some things in there that we significantly welcome in terms of the women's health package, in terms of the increase to maternity and other benefits, but still significant concerns that even though there are those increases, there's no real structural reform towards actually advancing social equalities in a visionary way.
Thank you very much, Donald. I think you've summed it up well. And then just Sean, I saw you had your question there, and then we'll answer them.
Imagine not letting Sean ask a question.
No. Not to worry, he's getting used to that. But anyway, I thought you did a fantastic job on two fronts at least, a lot of fronts, but two that I would highlight out. One is identifying this legacy issue, that the legacy is regressive. And I think that is being missed in the wider debate. Now there might be little bits and pieces about it, but it to us, I think to me, it's a very big issue. And combined with that, there's the very limited vision that's guiding the what they've been doing for the last 5 years, and the results are staggering, really. Like you highlighted the issue about a couple on 100 grand being €73 plus a week better off compared to 73. Compared to a couple on 30,000 being only €3 plus being better off after 5 budgets. I'm sure they're delighted with their €3.34 after 5 budgets, But there's, at the core of it, to deal with the question that Flachta raised about what do you do going forward, it seems to me that focusing on those two issues is critical. Because at the end of the day, you make a comment there which I think is very powerful. You say a more appropriate increase in all quarterly welfare rates rather than this one-off business would enable households to buy essentials routinely and not to just have them as treats. And I think with all due respects, the vast resources that we have, we should at least have a situation where people had the basics and not trying to just have them as treats in response to one-off payments. So in terms of the future, ensure that the legacy is actually focused on eliminating poverty and not on these one-off fixes, and the other piece being very much about a guiding vision and a structure going forward over the 5 years that would prioritise the people that needed the resources and not waste it basically on people who don't need it at all, which has been what's happening. Well done again.
Okay, so I'm going to divvy these out. Suzanne, I am going to ask you to answer Flachta's question about the issue of one-off payments and what that means in terms of income distribution, our poverty figures, and what that even means in terms, because we're going to be redoing the roadmap for social inclusion. What is that going to mean in terms of the targets there? Also, the issue that Donald raised in terms of the different income certainty for households. You know, one-off payments don't really assist with that, and in terms of your planning, because all households plan, they're all prudent, they all budget for their bills, etc. So the impact that one-off payments also has on and places an additional challenge on people there. And then, John, you might speak to the point in terms of the election going forward and looking at, you know, I mean, if they really want to put the common good at the heart of policy, how do you do that in a progressive way? So I'll start with you, Suzanne.
And then give me a nudge when I'm still talking 10
Yes.
minutes time. That's grand, yeah. I mean, the disability space is, like, when we look again at the statistics of the percentage of the population that live with a disability or an impairment, and that is only going to increase as we age, because most disabilities will be part of the ageing process. So it's that vision piece, I think, which is really, really necessary to prepare for this. But it's exactly that. Like, I think we all had minor breakdowns with the last Silk data, trying to get our head around it. So if you factor in for inflation but take out the one-off measures, who's, you know, what are we actually talking about here? And even when we acknowledge that in the Silk data, a lot of the really low-income households aren't even included, so it's not actually capturing all the data in it. But there wasn't, I mean, again, we've got pages of stuff here, you know, from the Department of Supports for People with Disabilities or Disabled People, and there's nothing really here that was any different to any other core social welfare rate, which again doesn't take into account this enormous Indicon report, cost of disability, and that was pre the inflation figures, so that was putting it at maybe 8 to 12, 15,000 a year extra. So your core social welfare rate might only cover your cost of disability and not your actual core costs. So, like, there's real concerns here about targeting that population correctly, and I don't see any real evidence of this. And again, those lump sum measures, they wash through very, very quickly, and you are still unable to work because of your disability or your impairment. So there's nothing really here, I don't think, for the communities that you represent. The piece about certainty, I mean, it's uncertainties that kills us in the end. You know what I mean? It's the one thing we really aren't good at, is not knowing what's going to happen. But the percentage piece, I think, is really, really insightful as well. Like, there was a post-budget analysis done, I think maybe 2-3 years ago, which I thought was interesting, when they pointed to the fact that those on the reduced rate of social welfare, so the under 25s, they got a 10% increase. And high earner households, say those over 100,000, had maybe a 0.something% increase. And I thought, yeah, I think I know which one puts more dinners on the table, though. So, you know, you can hide behind those statistics. And I think that's why it's really, really important that we actually say, you know, those low income households got an extra €12 a week, when that doesn't even buy you an awful lot anymore in the supermarket. But I mean, I thought, what was interesting, I think, in the social welfare space, though, just in general, was that touting of a reduced rate for anybody in receipt of job seekers allowance, and they didn't go ahead with it in the end. So I just thought, you know, it's that conversation. We're back to deserving versus undeserving. We're back to people who get up very early in the morning, which I think is probably most people living in emergency accommodation. I think they have to get up very early in the morning. So I just thought it was interesting that was even touted. At a time when, again, there are resources here to be able to tackle these issues of poverty, and it's the same cohorts that come up over time and time and time again. So I don't understand why. That's probably the end of that sentence, really, isn't it? I don't really understand why we can't do better in these spaces. We have all the data, we have all the research, we can see what's being done all across the country, all across the world, and I mean, ultimately, the answer to homelessness is a home. Income poverty, it's extra money.
Thanks, Suzanne. This is a nice segue into the question for John, because when you start pitting groups against each other or prioritising them, it's clear there's an election on the horizon.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, we should be taking the exact opposite view when it comes to what comes after the election. And rather than looking at our community, our society, and trying to break it up into small different parts, what really needs to happen after the election is we need to have a programme for government that is underpinned by a vision of the common good, and you know, that vision of the common good has to be one where everybody has enough, where both in terms of their income and in terms of access to services, where their material needs are provided for, but also their social needs, that there's a real inclusion and participation for all people. And, you know, Socialist Ireland has kind of long argued for a new social contract, kind of underpinned by that concept of the common good, where, you know, we've sought that, yes, we have to have a vibrant economy. That's absolutely essential. But in addition to that vibrant economy, we also have to then have, you know, fair taxation that's sufficient. We need to have decent services and infrastructure. We need to have good governance, and, you know, we've seen an enormous amount of waste in a couple of stories in recent weeks. You know, so there has to be good governance, and that good governance can't just be at the high level. That has to feed down so that what we really have is a truly democratic country. And we have to have sustainability, because obviously, whether we're talking about environmental sustainability or financial or whatever, you know, we need to be looking to the future. So what we would like to see in any new future programme for government is a long-termism that actually is planning for not the next 5 years, but the next 50 years. All of this needs to be guided by a real social dialogue. Having a small group of ministers and civil servants make decisions for the entire country is not the way forward. We need to engage all sectors of society, and we would strongly support at two ends, both at the local end through the public participation networks, and having real engagement between local policy making and national policy making, for that matter, and community groups through the public participation networks, the PPNs, and then at the national level, having bringing together the pillars of social dialogue, the employers, the trade unions, the farmers, the environmental sector, and the community and voluntary sector, to actually not simply be consulted ad hoc, but be fully engaged in outlining what is needed and what our vision for the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years needs to be. And the key thing about social dialogue is, because if you're actually talking to the people on the ground, and you're doing it consistently and regularly and in a structured manner, you can see the issues coming down the line. Okay, you can see the problems coming down the line, and therefore government can be in a better position to tackle them. So I suppose I'm not sure if that addresses the question of what to expect or what maybe we should be looking for in any future government. But clearly, what we haven't had over the last 5 years is budgetary policy that really has focused on narrowing the gap between the rich and poor. That has to be prioritised. We need to have real solidarity. So, you know, that issue that was mentioned, I think Sean mentioned about the, we have it in our text, but one-off measures, you know, aren't good enough. You can't simply give people a treat. There's an issue of dignity here, and providing adequate incomes for people is about dignity, because it frees them to make decisions about their own lives and about how to plan, you know, for their week and for their month and for their year. So, Michelle.
Thank you, John. And I think we can probably finish up there. I think on that note, thanks everyone for coming. And I would urge you all, given that it's coming into election season, when someone knocks on your door and asks for your vote, the very first thing you should do is ask them how they're going to pay for the things in the next 10 and 20 years. How are they going to pay for pensions, disability services, social welfare rates, more homes, maintaining our infrastructure? Because if they come onto your doorstep and start promising you tax cuts, those tax cuts have to be paid for, because that's money they're not going to be taking in the next year, the year after, the year after. So either that money has to be cut from the services budget, the current expenditure, or they have to raise that tax somewhere else. So I would say please, 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 because the government that can tell you how they are going to resource the future. We had a lot of talk yesterday, I would say lip service to future generations. I didn't see anything in that documentation that's really going to provide for future generations. So those are the kind of things you should be asking those people who are going to come and knock on your door and look for your vote, because this is the one time in a 5-year process that you really do hold the power. So thank you very much to everyone for coming, and also to all those people who joined us online as well.
And just before we wrap up, a reminder that we will be having our social policy conference on the 13th of November online, and that'll soon, I think, be available to register. So please keep that in mind and look into it as well. And again, thanks very much to Suzanne, to Michelle and to Mansi, and to the team from Kairos here as well who are helping stream this. Thanks very much, everybody.